Few people ever notice the exact moment an empath begins to change. It does not start with anger. It does not begin with a loud argument or a dramatic goodbye. It begins in silence. One more disappointment, one more broken promise, one more day of carrying emotions that were never theirs to carry. Most people believe an empath can forgive forever because they are naturally compassionate, patient, and deeply understanding. They seem to have endless kindness, endless second chances, and endless emotional strength. But psychology tells a different story. Even the kindest person has limits, and when those limits are ignored for too long, the mind begins protecting itself in ways that can surprise everyone around them. The most shocking part is that an empath's breaking point rarely looks like an emotional explosion. More often, it looks like calmness. It looks like quiet distance. It looks like a person who suddenly stops chasing, stops explaining, and stops sacrificing themselves for people who never appreciated what they gave. Many mistake this change for becoming cold, but the truth is far more fascinating. It is often the result of years of emotional exhaustion, one-sided relationships, constant disappointment, emotional neglect, and the painful habit of putting everyone else's needs above their own. In this video, you will discover what really happens inside an empath's mind when they finally reach their breaking point, why this transformation is rooted in psychology rather than revenge, why people are often shocked by the change, and why this final stage may actually be the beginning of emotional healing instead of the end of kindness. Some of these insights are rarely discussed, yet they explain why an empath can seem like a completely different person almost overnight, even though that change has been quietly building for years. Stay with us until the very end, because the biggest realization is not about losing empathy at all. It is about discovering the hidden moment when compassion finally includes yourself. Welcome to Shadow Wisdom. If you enjoy exploring the hidden psychology behind human behavior and emotional intelligence, make sure to subscribe and join our growing community for more thought-provoking videos every week. The deepest wounds carried by an empath are often the ones no one ever sees, including the empath themselves. While many people believe emotional pain always announces itself through tears, anger, or obvious suffering, the truth is often much quieter. An empath can spend years convincing themselves that everyone else's feelings matter more than their own. This pattern does not appear overnight. It develops slowly through personality, life experiences, and repeated emotional habits. People with high emotional sensitivity naturally notice changes in tone, facial expressions, and emotional energy that others overlook. They quickly recognize sadness hidden behind a smile, frustration buried beneath polite words, or loneliness that someone tries to hide from the world. This ability allows them to form deep connections, but it also creates an invisible burden. Instead of simply understanding another person's emotions, they often begin carrying those emotions as if they were their own. Over time, the line between caring for others and losing themselves becomes difficult to recognize. Helping people no longer feels like a choice. It becomes part of their identity. Their value begins to depend on how much comfort they can provide, how many problems they can solve, and how much pain they can absorb without asking for anything in return. Because of this, many empaths develop a quiet fear of hurting others, even when protecting themselves would be completely reasonable. Saying no feels cruel. Setting boundaries feels selfish. Speaking honestly about their own pain feels like creating another problem for someone else. So instead of expressing disappointment, they remain silent. Instead of asking for support, they convince themselves they can handle one more difficult conversation, one more broken promise, one more act of disrespect. They tell themselves that people are simply having a hard time, that everyone deserves another chance, and that patience will eventually fix what honesty has failed to change. Little by little, they begin treating their own emotional needs as less important than everyone else's comfort. This is one of the biggest psychological traps an empath can fall into. Compassion slowly transforms into emotional self-sacrifice. People-pleasing grows naturally from this mindset. At first, it feels generous. They willingly adjust their schedule, change their plans, forgive repeated mistakes, and ignore behavior that makes them uncomfortable, because keeping peace seems more important than creating conflict. Every small compromise feels harmless on its own, but those compromises quietly accumulate over months and even years. The empath starts apologizing for things that were never their fault. They become responsible for fixing moods they did not create. They begin measuring the success of every relationship by how happy everyone else feels, while rarely asking themselves a much more important question. Am I happy? That simple question becomes surprisingly difficult to answer because their attention has been directed outward for so long that they have almost forgotten how to look inward. Many people mistake this endless patience for emotional strength. But psychology suggests something different. Constant emotional self-sacrifice does not make pain disappear. It simply delays it. Every ignored feeling remains stored beneath the surface. Every unspoken frustration quietly waits. Every disappointment leaves a small mark that may seem insignificant on its own, but eventually becomes impossible to ignore. This is why empaths often tolerate unhealthy behavior much longer than most people. They continue believing that love means understanding, forgiving, waiting, and giving without limits. They confuse emotional responsibility with genuine love. They believe that if someone is struggling, they must stay regardless of how much damage the relationship is causing. They begin carrying responsibilities that never truly belong to them. They feel guilty for protecting themselves because somewhere along the way they learned that being needed feels safer than being rejected. This silent pattern creates the beginning of a much larger emotional process. Long before anyone notices a visible change, the breaking point has already begun growing beneath the surface. Friends, family members, and partners usually continue seeing the same caring person who always listens, always understands, and always forgives. They do not notice the emotional calculations happening inside the empath's mind every single day. They cannot see the exhaustion hidden behind polite conversations. They cannot hear the constant internal debate between protecting personal peace and protecting someone else's feelings. The empath continues smiling because smiling has become easier than explaining years of accumulated emotional weight. Their kindness remains visible, but their emotional reserves slowly disappear. This is where emotional overload begins to develop. It rarely arrives all at once. Instead, it grows through repeated moments that seem ordinary from the outside. Another promise is broken. Another effort goes unnoticed. Another difficult conversation ends with the empath apologizing simply to restore peace. Each event appears small, but together they create emotional burnout. The mind grows tired of carrying stress that never receives relief. Compassion, once limitless, begins showing signs of fatigue. Psychologists often describe this as compassion fatigue, a condition in which constantly caring for others leaves very little emotional energy for yourself. Instead of feeling refreshed after helping someone, the empath begins feeling drained. Conversations that once brought purpose now leave exhaustion. Emotional support starts feeling like a responsibility instead of a gift. At the same time, invisible stress continues building inside the nervous system. The empath may still function normally. They go to work, they spend time with friends, they laugh at jokes, they complete daily responsibilities. From the outside, everything appears perfectly fine. Yet beneath that calm surface, the body remains in a nearly constant state of emotional tension. Small disappointments begin affecting them more deeply because they are no longer reacting to one event. They are reacting to years of accumulated emotional pressure. Suppressed anger quietly joins sadness. Resentment slowly replaces hope, not because they enjoy feeling resentful, but because every ignored boundary sends the same message to the mind. My needs can wait. My feelings are less important. My peace is negotiable. Every ignored boundary increases that pressure. Every time an empath accepts treatment that conflicts with their values simply to avoid hurting someone else, another layer of emotional weight is added. Most people never notice this process because the empath rarely complains. They continue offering encouragement while privately running out of emotional strength. They continue comforting others while secretly wishing someone would finally ask how they are doing and genuinely listen to the answer. The greatest burden is not always giving too much. Sometimes it is feeling that giving has become the only acceptable version of yourself. Eventually, a quiet shift begins. Hope starts losing its influence. The empath no longer waits for dramatic improvements because experience has taught them that the same patterns usually repeat. This is the stage where emotional exhaustion becomes stronger than hope. It is not dramatic. It is not loud. It is simply the slow realization that endless patience cannot change people who refuse to change themselves. That realization transforms everything. The breaking point almost never looks the way people expect. There is rarely shouting or emotional chaos. There is no desperate attempt to make someone finally understand. Instead, there is stillness. The empath becomes unusually calm because they are no longer fighting an internal battle between staying and leaving. The decision has already formed deep inside. Emotional numbness replaces constant emotional effort. Mental exhaustion removes the desire to explain the same feelings again and again. Attachment slowly fades because trust has already been worn away through repeated disappointment. Acceptance quietly replaces resistance. Letting go becomes easier than carrying another impossible emotional weight. This is why people around them are often shocked. They ask why the empath suddenly changed. They wonder why someone who once cared so deeply now seems distant. What they fail to realize is that this change did not happen in a single day. It developed through hundreds of unnoticed moments. The breaking point is not when an empath starts feeling too much. It is when they stop believing things will ever change. Once that belief disappears, so does the need to keep sacrificing themselves for relationships that only survive because one person keeps giving. From that moment forward, their behavior begins to look very different. They start creating boundaries they once avoided. They say no without carrying endless guilt afterward. They stop explaining every decision because they no longer feel responsible for managing everyone else's emotional reactions. Unhealthy relationships quietly come to an end. Peace becomes more valuable than approval. Protecting their emotional energy becomes more important than pleasing people who never protected it in return. To those who benefited from the empath's endless availability, this transformation can seem cold or even selfish. Yet nothing could be further from the truth. The empath has not lost their kindness. They have simply stopped abandoning themselves in order to keep everyone else comfortable, and that quiet decision changes every relationship they will ever have from that moment forward. One of the most surprising parts of an empath's breaking point is not the change inside the empath. It is the reaction from everyone around them. The very people who once relied on their endless patience often become the most confused. They begin asking questions that seem simple on the surface, but reveal something much deeper. Why are you acting differently? Why are you so distant now? Why don't you care like you used to? To them, it feels as though the empath has suddenly become a completely different person. But what they are really experiencing is the loss of unlimited access to someone who was always available. For years, they became used to a version of the empath who answered every call, listened to every problem, forgave every mistake, and made room for everyone else's emotions even when there was no room left for their own. That level of emotional availability slowly became normal. They stopped seeing it as an extraordinary act of kindness and began expecting it as part of the relationship. The empath was no longer appreciated for giving so much because giving had become predictable. What once felt like generosity gradually became an unspoken obligation. This is why boundaries can feel so confusing to people who have never experienced them before. A healthy boundary simply says that both people matter equally. It says that one person's needs cannot always come before another's. It says that respect should move in both directions. Yet someone who has benefited from unlimited emotional access may not see it that way. Instead of hearing a boundary, they hear rejection. Instead of seeing self-respect, they see distance. Instead of recognizing healing, they believe they are being punished. The empath may simply say they need time alone, that they cannot solve every problem anymore, or that they are no longer willing to accept certain behavior. These are healthy decisions. But to someone who is comfortable receiving endless emotional support without offering the same in return, those decisions feel unexpected. The relationship has changed because the balance has changed. Some people respond to this change with understanding. They recognize that everyone deserves emotional limits. Others struggle because the old pattern benefited them. Without realizing it, they may begin using manipulation to restore the relationship to its previous form. The manipulation is not always obvious. Sometimes it appears as disappointment. Sometimes it hides behind sadness. Sometimes it arrives wrapped in words that sound caring but quietly create guilt. They might remind the empath of everything they have been through together. They may suggest that the empath is abandoning them during a difficult time. They may question whether the empath still cares. These reactions often have one purpose: They attempt to make the empath feel responsible for emotions that are no longer theirs to manage. Guilt has always been one of the strongest emotional pressures an empath faces. Because they naturally care about how other people feel, guilt becomes an easy way to influence their decisions. In the past, even a small sign of disappointment from someone else could make the empath ignore their own needs once again. They would cancel plans, forgive another broken promise, overlook another disrespectful comment, or continue carrying emotional burdens that should have been shared. But after reaching their breaking point, guilt begins losing its power. Not because the empath has stopped caring, but because they finally recognize the difference between compassion and responsibility. Caring about someone does not mean sacrificing your emotional health forever. Supporting someone does not mean accepting endless disrespect. Loving someone does not require abandoning yourself. Another reason people become confused is emotional dependency. Some relationships slowly become built around one person constantly giving emotional stability while the other constantly receives it. The empath becomes the listener, the problem solver, the peacemaker, and the emotional support system. Whenever conflict appears, everyone expects the empath to fix it. Whenever someone feels overwhelmed, they turn toward the empath for comfort. At first, this creates closeness, but over time it creates imbalance. The relationship begins depending on one person's emotional labor. Once that person steps back, everyone notices the emptiness that was always being quietly filled. Instead of asking why they relied so heavily on one individual, they often question why the empath changed. Human beings naturally resist change, especially when the old situation felt comfortable. Even healthy changes can create discomfort because they require people to adjust their expectations. This resistance is not always intentional. The brain prefers familiar patterns because they feel predictable and safe. When an empath suddenly introduces healthy boundaries, every established pattern inside the relationship is interrupted. Conversations change, expectations change, emotional responsibilities change. The people involved must either grow alongside those changes or continue wishing things would return to the way they were before. That is why healing often exposes relationships more clearly than conflict ever could. Some people celebrate your growth because they genuinely care about your well-being. Others resist your growth because your old behavior made their lives easier. One of the hardest truths an empath eventually discovers is this. When someone benefits from your lack of boundaries, your healing can feel like betrayal to them. That feeling does not automatically mean they are cruel people. Sometimes they simply became accustomed to a relationship that quietly revolved around your self-sacrifice. They grew comfortable receiving what you constantly gave without realizing how much it was costing you. The moment you stop giving beyond your limits, they experience loss. They may describe that loss as abandonment, even though you are simply treating yourself with the same kindness you have always offered everyone else. As this transformation continues, another important process begins inside the empath. From the outside, it may appear as emotional distance. But inside the brain, something very different is happening. The nervous system has spent months or even years responding to constant emotional pressure. Every conflict, every disappointment, every ignored boundary has required emotional energy. Living in that state for long periods creates chronic stress. The brain is not designed to remain emotionally alert forever. Eventually, it begins searching for ways to protect itself. One of those protective responses is emotional regulation. Instead of reacting intensely to every situation, the mind gradually lowers its emotional investment in relationships that repeatedly create pain. Many people misunderstand this stage because emotional regulation can look like emotional detachment. The empath no longer argues endlessly. They stop chasing explanations. They stop trying to convince people to care. They stop replaying every conversation in their mind. Rather than spending hours wondering how to fix every relationship, they quietly accept what cannot be changed. This is not emotional cruelty. It is psychological adaptation. The brain recognizes that endless emotional investment has produced exhaustion rather than connection. To recover, it begins directing emotional energy toward places where it is healthier and more sustainable. This process also protects the nervous system. When someone experiences repeated emotional stress without enough recovery, the body remains in a heightened state of alertness. Sleep may become difficult. Concentration may decrease. Anxiety becomes easier to trigger. Even ordinary conversations begin feeling emotionally heavy. Creating emotional distance from harmful situations allows the nervous system to slowly return to balance. The empath starts experiencing moments of calm that once felt impossible. Silence no longer feels lonely. Solitude begins feeling peaceful instead of empty. Their emotional energy is no longer constantly pulled in every direction. They begin noticing how much strength they spent surviving situations that never should have become normal. Reduced emotional investment is another natural part of healing. This does not mean the empath has stopped loving people. It simply means they stop investing deeply in relationships that repeatedly ignore their efforts. Emotional energy becomes intentional rather than automatic. Trust is no longer given without evidence. Time is shared with people who respect it. Attention is offered where appreciation exists. This shift often surprises those who only knew the older version of the empath. They mistake healthy emotional balance for indifference because they never realized how unbalanced the relationship had become. Perhaps the biggest misunderstanding of all begins here. People often say that the empath changed. They speak as though kindness disappeared and compassion faded away. Yet that interpretation misses the most important truth. The empath did not lose their personality. Their generosity did not vanish. Their ability to care for others did not suddenly disappear. What disappeared were the unhealthy patterns that had quietly controlled their life for years. They stopped accepting responsibilities that never belonged to them. They stopped believing they had to rescue everyone in order to deserve love. They stopped measuring their worth by how much pain they could endure without complaining. The person they become after healing is often much closer to who they always were beneath the exhaustion. Their kindness remains, but it is guided by wisdom instead of guilt. Their empathy remains, but it now includes themselves. Their compassion becomes stronger, because it is no longer fueled by fear of rejection or the need for approval. They begin helping because they choose to, not because they believe they must. They begin loving without losing themselves. They begin listening without absorbing every emotional burden placed before them. Their peace becomes something worth protecting, rather than something constantly sacrificed. This leads to the greatest realization of all. A breaking point is not the moment an empath loses the ability to care. It is the moment they stop believing that caring requires endless self-neglect. For years, they may have believed that kindness meant saying yes to everything, forgiving everything, understanding everyone, and carrying every emotional burden without question. They believed compassion had no limits because they confused limits with selfishness. Yet real compassion was never meant to erase the person giving it. The kindest people are not limitless. They simply spend years believing they should be. Their true strength is not found in how much pain they can silently carry. It begins the moment compassion finally includes the person who has been forgotten for the longest time. Themselves. As we reach the end of this journey, one truth becomes impossible to ignore. An empath does not reach their breaking point because they are weak. They reach it because they have been strong for far too long without receiving the same care they so freely gave to others. Their breaking point is not created by a single argument, one bad day, or one difficult relationship. It is built through years of emotional exhaustion, constant disappointment, silent sacrifices, and the habit of putting everyone else's happiness before their own. Every ignored feeling, every broken boundary, and every unspoken hurt slowly adds weight until the heart simply cannot carry it anymore. We also discovered why this transformation surprises so many people. When someone has always been patient, forgiving, and available, others naturally become used to that version of them. So when the empath finally begins setting boundaries, protecting their peace, and saying no without guilt, it can feel shocking. Some people mistake those healthy boundaries for rejection. Others believe the empath has become cold or distant. But the reality is much deeper. Healing changes relationships because it changes the role the empath has been playing for years. Relationships built on mutual respect often become stronger, while relationships built on endless self-sacrifice begin to fall apart. That is not failure. It is clarity. Perhaps the greatest lesson of all is that self-respect is never selfish. Choosing your own peace does not mean you have stopped loving others. It means you have finally learned that your own emotional well-being deserves the same care, patience, and compassion you have always given away so freely. Real empathy was never meant to destroy the person who possesses it. It was always meant to exist alongside healthy boundaries, self-worth, and emotional balance. Sometimes, the person everyone believed would stay forever is the one who quietly walks away first. Not because they stopped caring, but because they finally understood that love should never require losing yourself. They realize that protecting their peace is not an act of revenge. It is an act of healing. And perhaps that is the most powerful transformation of all. The empath does not become less kind. They simply become kind enough to include themselves. If this video gave you a new perspective on empathy, emotional healing, and the hidden psychology behind human behavior, take a moment to support the channel. Click the like button, subscribe to Shadow Wisdom, and turn on notifications so you never miss our future videos exploring the deeper side of the human mind. Share this video with someone who always puts everyone else first, because these words may arrive exactly when they need them most. And before you go, tell us in the comments, do you believe an empath's breaking point is a sign of weakness, or is it the first step toward real emotional strength? Your thoughts could inspire someone else who is quietly walking the same path. Until our next journey together, keep seeking wisdom, protect your peace, and remember that the strongest hearts are not the ones that carry every burden forever, but the ones that finally learn when it is time to put the weight down.